And it's but I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started, I think. So thank you all for being here. I'm really glad you're all here. I want to make sure that everybody got a raffle ticket. If you didn't, just go and grab one. We are going to have a raffle at the end of the presentation today. And also take food, take coffee, and all of that. So I'm so glad to have you all here with us today. My name's Elizabeth McMuntatenko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Christopher Ojeda, who is going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you would like to be featured in a future talk, please let me know. We're always looking for more speakers. For today, Christopher Ojeda is an associate professor of political science at UC Merced and a research affiliate at the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. His research explores the intersection between politics and policy and mental health and poverty. His work has been published in American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, American Sociological Review, and has been featured on CNN, PBS, Slate, and Vox. Dr. Ojeda holds a BA in government from Christopher Newport University and both an MA and PhD in political science from Pennsylvania State University. And his work has been funded by the Russell Sage Foundation. And we're really happy to have him here with us today. I'm going to turn this over to him.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to this faculty series. I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about this book I just wrote called The Sad Citizen, How Politics is Depressing and Why It Matters. And I actually want to just take you back several years to tell you a little bit about how I started writing about depression. When I went to graduate school, I wrote my dissertation on a topic called the income participation gap, which is the fact that people who have more money tend to participate in politics more than people who have less money. And I was really interested in this question, why is it that the rich participate more than the poor? Because I grew up in a very poor family, and you know, a lot of political scientists had written on this topic, but I didn't feel like my experiences growing up were reflected in the literature. And I thought there was more to say about it. And one of the things I thought there was to say about it had to do with depression. We know that poverty is probably the biggest risk factor for depression. And I thought maybe depression can explain why it is that the poor participate less. You know, if you're poor and that sort of financial insecurity, that financial hardship is making you feel depressed, it seems likely that you're going to be less participative. You know, depression is really, it's, you know, you're tired, you're exhausted, you don't want to be engaged, you're less interested in social life. And if that applies to politics, then maybe it's an explanation for this income participation gap. And so one of the chapters of my dissertation was demonstrating that feelings of depression make people less participative in politics. And it was just a really small part of my research agenda. I actually didn't even think, you know, I didn't really think much about it at the time, but it became something that was really interested. Nobody had written about depression. And I think the reason in political science, people had written about other kinds of emotions, people had written about anxiety, people had written about anger, but no one had written about depression. And I think the reason no one writes about depression is it's a private emotion. It's something we do by ourselves. We don't want to see other people, you know, we don't want other people to see us feeling sad or depressed. We go into our room, we go into our office, we close the door. And anger and anxiety are really public emotions. They're loud emotions. They're visible. You know, people who are angry, they take to the streets, right? They make themselves known. And so they're really easy to see. And so I think, you know, depression had just been invisible for so long. And so I was bringing attention to it and people became really interested. And so I kept writing about it. I started publishing more articles and I was sort of looking at how does depression shape the way citizens think about and engage with politics. And I've published a lot of research since then showing that depression can, you know, not only makes you less participative, makes you less trusting of government, it makes you less efficacious. You feel like, you know, your voice doesn't count as much. It makes you less satisfied with democracy. It makes you less interested in politics. There's all these political consequences of feeling depressed. And then in 2016, I think we all remember what happened in 2016, Donald Trump was elected. And I had a very close friend of mine, after his election, she became very, very depressed, like clinically depressed. And she's given me permission to talk about her story. And that's when I first thought, can politics cause depression? Up until then, I'd been thinking about how depression influences our politics. And now I was thinking about how our politics influences how we feel. I thought, can politics make us feel depressed? I see my friend is very depressed, but is she just an anomaly, or is she representative of something more systematic? But I didn't start writing about it then because, I felt as a political scientist, I was supposed to write about political outcomes. And, depression was something that was reserved for psychiatrists and psychologists and maybe sociologists. But then in 2020, and we all also know what happened then, the pandemic happened. And I think we saw mental health decline all around the world. And maybe some of us here even experienced decline in mental health. I know I did. And I know a lot of people who in my sort of personal network, I saw their mental health really take a toll because of the pandemic. And that's when I thought I have to write this book. And that's when I started writing this book. So I'm so excited to be here today to tell you about it, because I think it's really a really important topic. And I think it's something that a lot of people in this country feel right now, a sense of depression because of politics. So let's get into it. I want to take you to here we go. I want to take you back to 2020, well, the early Biden presidency. So 2021, really. He was elected in the fall of 2020, in November 2020. And people were sort of, I think a lot of people, Democrats, were really optimistic about what his candidacy would bring. But very quickly, people started to sour on him. If you recall, there was that one of the first things he did was withdraw troops from Afghanistan, and it didn't go so well. There was sort of the botched withdrawal. And then even though he controlled both houses of Congress, he couldn't get his spending bill through, and people thought, what are you doing? And so that hopefulness that surrounded his election sort of became disappointment. And Ross Douthat in the New York Times even wrote about 2021 being the year of American disappointment. He writes, if 2020 was a year of crisis that seemed to open briefly into a more hopeful American future, 2021 was a year of closed doors, downward tugs, and steady disappointment. I think this is the first example we see of politics leading us to be depressed. Now, disappointment is, as I'm going to talk about what I mean by the term depression a little bit, but it's like the least intense version of what depression can be. But there's some evidence that, when politics doesn't go our way, it can make us feel a little down. I want to now take you back hundreds of years to 1860, a very different presidential election. In fact, this presidential election is odd in the sense that there were 4 candidates representing major parties that won electoral votes. Right? We're so accustomed in the United States to there just being 2 parties and 2 candidates who win electoral votes. And in this particular case, the country was going through what we call partisan realignment. So new parties were emerging and old parties were disappearing. And this election sort of occurred right at that moment of partisan realignment, where we ended up with 4 candidates. And as we now know, Abraham Lincoln won that election, and his win sort of triggered the South to secede from the Union, and the Civil War began. But shortly after he won his election, a white Southern woman wrote in her diary, I'm grieved for his thought now to be certainty that Lincoln and the Southern states are going to withdraw from the Union. If so, it is the beginning of woe. And this is another example of someone feeling down, feeling depressed because of something that has happened in politics. In this case, it has to do with the election of a candidate that she didn't want to be elected. Whereas with Biden, it had to do with the poor performance of a presidential candidate. They weren't doing as well as we had hoped them to do. They weren't doing the things we wanted them to do. And here she's using a little bit stronger language, the disappointment. She's using, she uses the terms grief and woe. And so it suggests that politics can do more than just leave us disappointed. It can make us feel, more intense versions of depression. And I want to take you forward in time, but to a very different part of the world. And I want to tell you about this this person named Kevin Carter. He was a photojournalist. He was South African photojournalist, and he originally got his start photographing apartheid in South Africa, and he was the first photojournalist to take a picture of an apartheid-related killing in South Africa. But then in the 1990s, in 1994, he was sent to Sudan to cover the famine that was occurring there, and he took this very famous photo. It won a Pulitzer Prize, and wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you guys had seen this, but this is a starving Sudanese child who's, as the picture shows, is sort of being preyed upon by a vulture. The vulture sort of waiting for the child to die. The child ends up living and making it to a camp where he can get some food. But this event in this particular image really haunted Kevin Carter, and several months after this, he ended up taking his own life, and he wrote in his diary, "The pain of life overrides the joy to the point that joy does not exist." He writes about being depressed. "I'm haunted by the vivid memories of killings and corpses and anger and pain, of starving or wounded children, of trigger-happy madmen, often police, of killer executioners." And I think this is an example of the most intense version of how politics can make us depressed. It can make us so depressed that maybe we think about suicide, or in some cases, in the case of Kevin Carter, he actually commits suicide. And I bring up these three examples because they sort of show that the range of these emotions that we can feel because of politics over wide swaths of time in very different parts of the world. And they all sort of show us that politics can be depressing. But the question I want to address in this book is politics systematically depressing? Are these, just like my friend who became depressed by Trump in 2016, are these cases, are they just anecdotal, or are they emblematic of something more systematic? And that's what this book is about. How is politics depressing, and with what consequence? Okay. I first want to address what I mean by the term depression and depressing. So we use this term in a lot of different ways in our life. I think probably the way we're most familiar is the clinical use of the term. So we would talk about mood disorders such as major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder. These disorders are defined by in the United States, they're defined by something called the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. It's a really ginormous book that psychiatrists use and psychologists use and therapists use to diagnose mental health issues among citizens. And they have very clear criteria for what constitutes depression. And major depressive disorder is just one of several different depressive mood disorders. So it's a clinical definition, and I think that tends to be what we think of when we hear that term. But we also use this term in the vernacular, right? Just kind of describing anything that's sad or tragic or pathetic. Maybe you sit down to lunch and you're having a salad, the leaves are a little wilted, you say, wow, this salad's really depressing. I'm going to use the term throughout the book in a third way, and I think it kind of bridges this vernacular and clinical approaches to the term, and I'm going to use it in an affective way, and I'm going to sort of think about it as a person who feels sunk with a weight on their existence, right? So it could be anything from disappointment. Disappointment makes you feel a little heavy, right? Or it could be something as intense as full-blown depressive disorder, and that's something where it's like you're so heavy you're not even getting out of bed, right? And I want to consider the full range of emotions because I think that politics can make a lot of people feel bad, can feel down without having their symptoms reach a clinical threshold. And those feelings, when you feel disappointed, when you feel let down, when you feel grief about politics, maybe you don't need a diagnosis from a therapist, but it's still painful. And it still affects the way you go about your life, and it still affects the way you think about politics, engage with politics. So I want to capture that full range of feelings that we have. And so I'm sort of going to approach it from this affective view. So I think it's probably intuitive to all of us here why we would want to study the politics of depression, but it's probably worth just enumerating a few reasons why. I think one is just undesirable. These feelings are undesirable. And if I can help bring attention to a new source of these feelings, politics, which hasn't been studied, political scientists haven't studied depression, and psychologists and psychiatrists haven't really studied politics much. So if I can sort of bridge these two fields and bring attention to a new source of depression, it could maybe help us alleviate these feelings. Now, I think as I sort of point out in the book, politics is always going to let us down. We're always going to feel, from time to time, we're always going to feel disappointed. We can't eliminate these feelings entirely from the political domain, but maybe we can make them less intense. Maybe we can make them more manageable. And so that's one goal I have with this book. And I think it's one reason why I want people to continue to study this. This is not the final word on the matter of this book. It's really just the opening word, in fact. I also think that feelings of depression are a challenge to democracy. The goal of the democratic state is the well-being of its citizens. And it's a problem if democracy is making people depressed rather than empowering them. And one question I asked through the book, and one question I want you guys to think about, is what do we do when what's good for democracy is bad for our mental health? Or what's good for our mental health is bad for our democracy? And let me give you an example of this. Elections are essential to democracy. I don't want to go so far as to say you can't have democracy without elections, but let's just put that out there. Let's just assume you can't have democracy without elections. You have to have elections. Well, we think elections are good because we value democracy, but elections produce winners and losers. And that losing can be really painful. I told you about my feelings following Trump's election in 2016. So we're not going to get rid of elections because we care about democracy, but maybe we can find a way to do elections better, to do elections in a way that do not make people feel so depressed. And that's one sort of theme that recurs through the book. Elections are just one example of this. There are other examples of our mental health and democracy coming into conflict. And I think that makes it worth studying more. And I also think a third reason is that we want to study this is I think it helps us understand the political process. So like I mentioned at the beginning, before I wrote this book, I had a whole lot of research highlighting the political consequences of depression. It makes us less trusting, less participative, less interested, less engaged. And that matters to who wins and who loses, right? I mean, I think we often focus on the factors that mobilize people, and I'm drawing attention to a very important demobilizing factor. And I think, to understand who wins and who loses, we need to not only look at who participates, but we need to look at who doesn't participate. And so I think depression plays a really critical role in the political process. Okay, so the key question I'm asking in this book is, how does politics make us depressed? And to answer this question, I'm going to start with a more general question, which is, how does anything make us depressed? And to answer this question, I'm going to start with an even more general one. And then how does anything make us emotional? And then I'll work backwards. So let's start with this question of how does anything make us emotional? Well, one common answer comes from psychology. And this is what they call the stress appraisal coping framework. And it's the framework I'm going to use in my book. So if something happens in the world, this is a stressor, there's some change. We interpret what happens. So it happens and we appraise it. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it consistent with our goals? Is it inconsistent with our goals? And then we have some kind of affective response. That could be we are made to feel anxious, we made to feel angry, we're made to feel depressed, we're made to feel proud or happy. And then we react to that feeling. So we try to manage that feeling. Maybe we want to feel if that thing that happens in the world makes us feel happy. Maybe our reaction is that we want to sort of lean into it. We want to feel more of that emotion. Maybe if it's something negative, it's emotion we don't like to feel, we want to feel less of it, and we cope with it by trying to suppress those feelings, or there's a variety of ways we can cope with it that I'll tell you about in a minute. So this answers that last question. How does anything make us feel emotional? So now that we have a framework for understanding how does anything make us feel emotional, we can now ask this question, how does anything make us feel depressed? And before I get there, this is just a sort of graphical depiction of that stress appraisal coping framework. So there's a stressor, but what response that stressor evokes is going to depend on how we interpret it, how we appraise it, and then that response gives rise to some coping mechanism. And we can cope in a couple different ways, right? If it's feelings of depression, maybe we want to make those feelings go away, right? Those are painful feelings, we don't like them. And we could try to make them go away by removing the problem. So by sort of targeting the stressor, so that's problem-focused coping. We could try to make them go away by interpreting what happened differently. So we could go through a reappraisal process, right? This is like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? That's all about reappraisal. Or we could try to directly target our feelings, right? So that would be sort of attention-focused coping. We're not thinking about the problem differently. We're not removing the problem. Maybe we just pay attention to something else. We redirect our attention, out of sight, out of mind. Or we could try to soothe the emotion, right? This is like the idea of self-care, right? You take a bath, you sort of do some yoga, you eat a comfort food, you watch a comfort movie. You're not solving the problem. You're not thinking about it differently. You're just trying to sort of lessen the pain. So these are different ways we can cope. So now we get to this question, how does anything make us depressed? Right? Well, depression is a response to irrevocable loss. So first, we have to experience some loss, and that's the stressor. And then we have to think of that loss as irrevocable. We think it's permanent. We think whatever's been lost is not something we can get back. And I think the quintessential example of this is the death of a loved one, right? In feeling grief when a loved one dies. And we experience a loss and we know that person's not coming back. But we can experience irrevocable loss in politics as well. And then our primary response, so then after we experience irrevocable loss, those feelings of depression are evoked. And then we cope with it. And the primary way we cope with feelings with irrevocable loss and those feelings is by withdrawing from social life. And I think there is, there's some strategic value to this, right? If you've lost something and you're not getting it back, maybe the best thing to do is just to step back from the situation and say, okay, what can I do? Like, what's next for me? Rather than trying to pour resources and time and energy into getting back whatever can't be gotten back, right? So withdrawing can actually help us cope with those feelings, but sometimes if the feelings are too intense, then withdrawal can also not be the most adaptive coping strategy, which I talk a little bit about in the book. But this gives you a sense of how anything can make us depressed. So the question now, that original question I had, we're sort of prepared to answer it. How does politics make us depressed? And throughout the book, I sort of have a chapter, and I'll get into these chapters in a minute. I'll talk a little bit about them, but I explain and show how politics systematically shapes the way loss is produced, gives rise to appraisals of irrevocability, and induces withdrawal as a coping strategy for dealing with feelings of depression. So there's a couple ways we can lose in politics. One is we have political preferences we care about. You want candidate A to be elected and candidate B gets elected. That's a loss, right? You want policy A to be passed and policy A fails in the legislature. That's a loss, right? So sometimes we lose when our political preferences cease to be fulfilled. We can also lose when politics takes away objects of personal value, right? So I think of this as like health, wealth, family, and home, right? These are the things we really care about. And when politics takes away those things, some policies passed and takes away our health insurance, some policies passed and it affects our home or affects our family member, that can be, and we lose them, maybe a family member sent off to war and they die in war or something. That'd be a very extreme example of a loss, but it happens, and that can be really, really depressing. So politics can also induce loss when it takes away objects of personal value. And then the third way I think about losses occurring in politics is when we work to enact change and that fails. So we pour lots of resources into getting some change, getting some policy passed, and then it fails. And we've lost that time, that energy, the hope of getting something changed, perhaps money. I think about this with climate activists, and actually I have a case study on climate activists later in the book. But they're really they're sort of a good example of this kind of loss, right? They, a lot of climate activists had poured their whole life into bringing about policies that are going to, keep the planet from burning up. And I think they're repeatedly faced with not being successful. And a lot of that's left a lot of them in a really bad place mentally. And so that'd be an example of that kind of loss. So it's a pretty heavy topic, but those are the kinds of loss we can experience. And then oftentimes these losses can feel irrevocable. And that's sort of by definition because of democracy. I mean, democracy is a system of governments where one person is not supposed to have power, right? And people are, power is diffused. And that means that you alone cannot bring about the policy you want or the election outcome you want. And so when something's lost, it can feel really, really, really hard to get it back in a democracy because it requires coordination among people. And so it's very easy for losses to feel irrevocable in politics. Okay, I just want to provide some initial evidence. So, I've sort of laid out this argument about how politics is depressing, but maybe we want to actually see, we want to look at some data. I tell my students, I see some students from my 175 class, which is, it's an undergraduate research methods course, and they learn how to collect data and analyze data. And I tell them, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. So here's my data. And so just as a first cut, I use lots of different data. And I'm going to present some results using polls today, but I do in-depth interviews of mental health professionals. I did survey experiments. I did surveys. I use administrative data. I use Google Trends data, lots of different data, case studies. So lots of data, and I'm just going to present a little snippet. But on Cornell's Roper Center archives, I say I here, I did not identify 414. I had an undergraduate student, an amazing undergraduate student who's gone on to graduate. He identified 414 poll questions that were asked between 1943 and 2022 about feeling disappointed, sad, or depressed by politics. And in the book, I analyze these questions to understand two things. What aspects of politics pollsters think produce depression, right? So they're not going to ask, oh, do you feel sad about X, if they think everybody's going to say no. So this gives me a little insight. Okay, well, what areas of politics do pollsters think are depressing? But then also whether people report feelings of depression when asked. I mean, sometimes the easiest way to just know how people feel is to ask them and let them say, yeah, I feel that, or no, I don't feel it. And in all these questions, people can say, I don't have this emotion. And so if they're saying they do, and there's no reason for them to, in fact, actually there's, if anything, people have a reason to underreport. They have a reason to say, I don't feel depressed because, I think as I go back to earlier, as I say, depression is a private emotion, there's maybe something a little bit shameful about telling an interviewer that you feel depressed or sad or disappointed. And so maybe some people are saying they don't have these feelings when they do. So these are going to be underestimates of how much people feel depressed. And just give you a little bit more information about the data. The questions cover a really wide range of topics, including elections, political violence, the poor performance of elected officials, and so on. I'll just give you an example of this. Fox News asked in 2004, how disappointed would you be if the presidential candidate you are planning to vote for, George W. Bush, loses the election? And what I do is I grab the top line data for all of these polls. So just and then I actually sort of also use a really strict test. So I only, this question, how disappointed would you be? So people could say, not at all disappointed, a little disappointed, somewhat disappointed, very disappointed. I only count a person as feeling disappointed if they say very, if they choose the most intense response option. So people who said somewhat disappointed, they're counted as not being disappointed. So I'm giving you really conservative estimates of how politics is depressing. So let's take a look at the results here. So the blue is for questions about depression, the orange is for questions about sadness, and the green is for questions about disappointment. And what we see is that a lot of people report feeling, a lot of people report these feelings when asked. And in fact, the fact that most of the answers are between 0 and 50% is actually reassuring in a way, because in politics is conflictual by definition. And that means that for some people, when something happens, it's bad, but for other people, it's a good thing. So I would expect about half of the people being asked these questions, are you going to be disappointed when George Bush is elected? Other people are like, no, I'm gonna be thrilled. I voted for him, right? So I would only expect upwards of half of respondents to ever say they're going to feel depressed about something that happens in politics. Now, what about these people who are above the 50% line? These are questions that ask about, do you feel sad about the assassination of JFK, right? And in that case, I think, lots of Americans, whether they voted for him or didn't vote for him, are reporting feelings of sadness, and so that's the kinds of questions that are on the higher end of this graph. But I think it's pretty clear to me that for a lot of people, when something bad happens in politics, it can evoke feelings of disappointment, sadness, and depression. Okay. With the remaining time I have before we get to Q&A and discussion, I just love to hear your comments. I'm just going to sort of walk you through the chapters of the book to give you a little preview about what I talk about. So in chapter 1, it's called A Sinking Feeling. I introduced the concept of depression and the stress appraisal coping framework. This presentation is pretty much it covers chapter 1 for the most part. I explain why it's important that we study these topics. In chapter 2, it's called When Politics Produces Loss, and it just looks at that first part of the stress appraisal coping framework. It focuses on loss, and I explain what the concept of loss is. I describe 3 ways it can be produced by politics, which I describe to you all here. And I draw on my interviews of mental health professionals to illustrate these kinds of losses. For a couple of years, I was interviewing mental health professionals all around the country. And I would ask them, I'd ask them a lot of questions, but one of the main questions I'd ask them is like, tell me about a time, or tell me about give me an example of a client coming in and talking about politics. What did they say? And it was really interesting to hear the kinds of responses they gave. And I'll return to this when I get to a later chapter. But in chapter 3, I focus on that appraisal part of the framework. So when loss becomes depressing. So sometimes losses, if we think that we can get them back, that they're temporary instead of permanent, that makes us feel angry, right? It's when it feels permanent, when it feels irrevocable, we appraise it as irrevocable, that we feel depressed. And so I focus on that appraisal component in chapter 3, and I provide that initial evidence of politics being depressing and show those polls, but I also do some survey experiments. And so that's a little bit stronger causal evidence of my argument. And then in chapter 4, I focus on coping. And I sort of introduce this concept of withdrawal. And I explain why withdrawal is especially likely in politics as opposed to our personal life. So in our personal life, we can, oftentimes we can deal with something bad by problem-focused coping. We can go and try to remove the problem. But in politics, we can't remove the problem on our own. So sometimes it's easier just to ignore it. And I see that a lot. People just, sometimes the best thing you can do is turn off the news, put down your phone. And in fact, I go in chapter 4, I sort of look at what advice do mental health professionals provide about how to cope with feelings of depression. And I go to popular psychology websites and I download all the recommendations that these websites have for coping with politics, and I organize them and say, these are the most common recommendations, these are the least common, and I will tell you right now, the most common is turn off the news. If politics is getting you down, it's okay to turn off the news. And this is actually, if you remember, I brought up this question earlier, what do we do when what's good for democracy is bad for our mental health? And that's a theme that runs through the book. And the news is a prime example of this, right? The good democratic citizen is someone who's informed. But sometimes being informed is not good for our well-being. And there's a tension there And what I want to encourage all of you guys to do is to think, it is okay to sometimes step back, step away from politics, if that's what I need to sort of recharge or really to deal with, problems in my personal life that are maybe the consequence of these feelings. And then the remaining chapters are sort of looking at specific areas of politics. So in chapter 5, I look at elections and electoral loss and how elections can be a source of depression. In chapter 6, I look at I call it the polarization of private life, but I look at political conflict in our personal relationships. So actually, a little peek into the book writing process. I didn't have this chapter in my original outline, and I only added it because when I was talking to those mental health professionals, every single one of them, when I said, "Give me an example," they'd say, "Well, let me tell you about this political conflict this client's feeling in their personal life. I'm talking to an adolescent who's bullied out of school for their political views. I do couples counseling, and all they do is bicker about politics. I have a Trump voter who thinks his girlfriend's going to dump him if she finds out he voted for Trump." So it was political conflict and personal relationships was so prevalent. And so I thought I have to add a chapter about this, and I did. And I think it really can be actually the way in which politics is most depressing. And then in chapter 7, I look at public policies and the way the passage of different policies can leave us feeling depressed. And I do these mini case studies, focusing on same-sex marriage, abortion policy, climate change, and redistributive policy. And then in the chapter 8, I sort of review what we've learned, talk about what we haven't learned. There's so much more to do on this subject matter, try to point a direction. And I try to also sort of point us forward in a direction about what's our goal here, right? As I said earlier, we can never eliminate these feelings from politics. Politics is always going to produce some loss, right? It's defined by conflict, it's defined by competition, it's defined by change. Sometimes you're winning, sometimes you're losing. But maybe we can build politics, maybe we can build democracy so that it doesn't produce such intense versions of these feelings that they disrupt our life. And we can build a democracy where these feelings are inevitable but manageable. And that's what I try to point us towards in the concluding chapter. So with that, I'll conclude there and open up for Q&A. Yeah.
You kind of mentioned this when you went over chapter 6, but how did your initial vision of the book change while and after you were doing your research and you were looking at polling data?
I would say so one chapter got dropped. I wanted to add a chapter that was like specifically dedicated to like the news and social media. I think we're all sort of familiar with the concept of doom scrolling. And I think I just kind of hit a limit. And also this other chapter on personal relationships sort of came about, and it was like easy for me to replace it. But I think that is a really important topic, and someone needs to write about that. So that was a change. And actually, another thing that changed, I did a book workshop here, and I had the second half of the book was actually the first half, and the first half was the second half, and the scholar who came to campus was like, "You have to reorganize these chapters," and a light bulb went off, and it was like, wow, of course, you're so right. But I think for the most part, besides sort of adding the chapter on personal relationships, dropping a chapter on social media, and then sort of that big reshuffling, the book was pretty true to how I originally envisioned it. Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
What's the term you mentioned at the start of the presentation where the rich tend to participate?
Oh yeah, it's called the income participation gap.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. And actually we can talk about this more later, but yeah.
I'm just curious in your research if you noticed like like often in politics, it's very much like us versus them, right, in the two political sides. Well, there's more than two, but obviously like the main two. So I guess I'm curious if you notice any like trends in like more or less depression in one side versus the other, or if it's pretty much across the board, for everyone.
That's a really good question, and actually I deliberately avoided any kind of this is how much Democrats are depressed, this is how much Republicans are depressed, or like liberals versus conservatives, because I wanted this book to make the point that anyone can feel depressed when they experience irrevocable loss in politics. And I didn't want the headline to sort of be like, oh, these liberal snowflakes cry over anything that happens in politics, right? And because actually a lot of the data I'm looking at, like I do this analysis of data that was actually Trump losing in 2020. And I think what we saw in the news was anger, right? I mean, we all remember January 6th, that was the display of anger. But I think for a lot of Republicans, a lot of Trump supporters who weren't at the Capitol on January 6th, they were actually feeling depressed about Trump's loss. And I have data that bears that out. And so I wanted that to be the main takeaway from the book. Having said that, I think your question is a very important one. And I'm currently working on a paper with a graduate student here that sort of digs into these polls to look to see if liberals or conservatives sort of respond with stronger feelings of depression when politics doesn't go their way. So hopefully I'll have an answer for you in like the next 6 to 8 months. Other questions? Yeah.
Did you find in your analysis, like age range, if there was showing of depression in younger folks more than older folks? Because I think the narrative is that older folks tend to really keep that inside because they're taught like men don't cry and be strong, whereas our younger generation is more vocal about how they're feeling.
So yeah, I one thing I didn't talk, it's a great question. I don't talk about this in the presentation, but I do in the book. So I mentioned that like we feel depressed by loss when that loss feels irrevocable, like we're not going to be able to get it back. And we feel anger when we feel like we can get it back, right? Well, different people in society have different resources and positions of power that make it more or less likely for them to be able to recover a loss. And people who are traditionally underrepresented in politics, young people, for example, women, racial minorities, so on and so forth, they have less power, they have less resources to recover losses when they happen. And what I find is that they are more likely to report feelings of depression in response to politics. As a result, the political elites, older people, wealthier people, they feel like there's more they can do when something doesn't go their way. They have more resources at their disposal, and so they're more likely to respond with anger, actually. So that's a really great question. But I actually refer to this as the political cycle of depression, right? So the people who have the least amount of power, they're the most likely to feel depressed by loss, and that depression makes them feel even more powerless, and it sort of creates this cycle. Yeah.
Did you use any in your surveys? Did you ask people about the current administration and how they felt about the previous election? If you did you see, I guess, like political related depression increasing or decreasing for the previous?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess it depends on what you mean by the current administration, because the current administration was also the administration and from 2016 to 2020. Because my book came out in 2025 and the production takes 11 months. So I actually finished the book before Trump was reelected. I don't actually have any data on his current term in the book, at least. But there are definitely questions in the polls that would have covered Trump's first term in office. And I don't break those out. And I sort of am always just kind of looking at the polls in that what we call the aggregate. But definitely I think it could be worth One thing I think would be worth looking to do actually is looking over time, because the polls go from 1943 to 2022. And we know that there's periods of really high polarization and periods of low polarization during this half century, more than half century, almost a century. And the 1960s are highly polarized, then sort of polarization decreases, but now it's sort of ramped back up. And I wonder if during these higher polarization periods, we see more depression. So it definitely could be worth breaking them out. Yeah, I'm back.
Influence that relationships can have depression. Because I think, as you mentioned, sometimes there was more influence, like if a more like depression, I guess, if a partner was like not from the same political party or maybe even family members. I know that also has a huge influence. Was there anyone who mentioned that?
Yeah, so so in that chapter 6, I used data from both the United States and Britain to look at this, and I'm in the United States, I'm looking at parent-child relationships, and then in Britain, I'm looking at households. So I have the British data, I have information at the household level, and I have information about everyone in the household, what party they belong to, and how interested they are in politics. And I find that households that are more fractionalized, they have people who are parts of different, in different parties, and those people really care about their party. Those are the households where you see the most depression, and households where everyone sort of agrees, you see the least amount of depression. And actually, this goes back to that theme. What do we do when what's good for democracy is bad for our mental health? So, we know that echo chambers are really bad for democracy. They can radicalize, they're sources of misinformation. But sometimes being in an echo chamber can be a source of comfort, right? And being exposed to cross-cutting ideas, especially when they're people who you think are supposed to be your friends or your loved ones or your family, it can be really hard on our mental health. And so how do we balance that? We want people exposed to cross-cutting ideas, but we also don't want those cross-cutting ideas to make people feel depressed. So it's a challenge, but yeah, that's the data I use. And then I also draw on the interviews of mental health professionals in that chapter. Yeah,
I
question.
was wondering, like, what kind of things can be done to make politics more healthy to like engage with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one thing I think about is in the election chapter here, I use this data from the European Social Survey, and most of those analysis focuses on the United States, but in that in the ESS, the European Social Survey, I analyze electoral loss in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is a really great case because it's like the most different electoral system from the United States. So we have like a winner-take-all system, and they have like a perfectly proportional system. And what I find actually is that electoral loss is much less depressing. Now, there could be cultural differences too. So this is just some preliminary evidence, right? But what I find is that electoral loss in the Netherlands is much less depressing. And I think it might be because in a proportional system, even if your party doesn't become the ruling party, the sort of coalition building party, you still win some seats, right? Like your votes still translate into seats. And so there's no true losers. Now, if you talk to the Dutch after an election, they would probably say, yeah, this, if they're on the losing side, this sucks, it's not great. But at least in my data, I found it was less depressing than losing in the United States. And so this sort of suggests that maybe there are electoral reforms that would make elections more manageable in terms of our mental health. Yeah.
The thing I'm finding depressing about elections in the United States is not that it goes left or goes right, but that so few are participating in the process.
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
Is there any connection between depression and a simple withdrawal from politics
Yeah,
altogether?
absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So people who are depressed are much less likely to participate, they're much less likely to vote, for sure. That is and that really cuts across all groups. But you bring up a really interesting point, which is like, the health of American democracy. If you feel like it's not doing well, people aren't participating, people are, I don't know, they're not being good Democrats in the sort of lowercase d Democrats. Maybe that's depressing, and that's something I haven't explored yet, but it would be a natural follow-up to the book. So I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
I'm curious if you did any like state by state comparison or analysis, and then if you looked at like states, for example, that are trying to take away voting rights and are becoming more authoritarian.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, there's this. So states, we sort of refer to states as traditionally we would refer to them as the laboratories of democracy, right? This allows different kinds of, states have different systems and they can experiment with passing different policies, and then other states can learn from them. But there's this political scientist at Berkeley, Jake Cronbach, who actually writes about states increasingly becoming laboratories of autocracy, at least some states. And so I do think the kind of analysis you're suggesting is a great idea. And there is state data. I think there's data I could use to do that kind of analysis. I haven't done it yet, but I think it's a really great idea. You should talk to me about that. Yeah.
I have lots of questions for you.
Yeah, please.
The one that's coming to mind right now relates to authoritarian regimes or different sort of, I'm not sure how you would classify it in your field, like trends or styles of leadership and how that impacts people. And I'm wondering if you have any information or thoughts about that, but also I'm hoping you could talk about more about future research where you think things might go, what the impact you hope for of this really interesting and important research.
Yeah, so in the book, I focus really only on democratic states and states as in countries. And really even there, it's like just Western democratic states. So, like Western Europe. I mean, I actually only analyzed data from the Netherlands and Britain outside the United States. And so I don't, I think some of the theory I've built could sort of apply to authoritarian states, but that's like not my area of expertise. I don't study autocracies. But I do think this, and this maybe feeds into your next question, is like, I think that potentially, autocracies could be even more depressing for citizens than democracies. And when I ask this question, like, what do we do and what's good for democracy is bad for mental health? This is not me trying to say democracy is bad, right? But definitely not that. What I'm trying to do is say democracy is good, but can we do it even better? And so what I would love is to like collaborate with some people who study autocracies and see if we can sort of better understand what these emotions look like there. So that's one. I think to sort of broaden out from specific ideas. I think what I really want is, I'm asking this question about like, what do we do when what's good for democracy is bad for our mental health or vice versa. And I'm very good at asking this question in the book, and I don't think I'm always so good at answering it. And so what I really want is a lot of smart people trying to answer it too, because I think the more people who are thinking about this problem, the better the chance we have of sort of making it so that politics is more bearable, because it can really sometimes feel really unbearable. Yeah. And then
Did you find a difference in people's feelings for different organizations in government? Like, America has multiple legislative bodies, whereas Britain would only have parliamentary body.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't look at that. So in this chapter, I do look at public policies, but I'm sort of looking at the consequences of a policy being passed. So like what happens when, if you same-sex marriage, like if you're sort of given this right or this right's taken away, or the right to abortion is taken away. But I'm not actually looking at the sort of procedure that underpins the policymaking process, but I think that could be interesting, especially as I sort of was saying, like pointing out the difference between proportional and winner take all electoral systems. There's analogs in terms of presidential and parliamentary systems, and so maybe there's something there that's worth looking at. And I think there was, okay, maybe this is the last question. Yeah.
Well, I want to know where you want to go with it next, but also, did you look at, or did any of it come out, like, for me, like corporate, influence into our democracy? If that, like, to me, like, it aligns with saying like kind of influence of healthcare, whether or not, like those kind of for-profit influences on our democracy. I know that's kind of depressing for me. But
Yeah.
did that surface at all, or?
No, well, I mean, I would say I don't, it didn't surface just because I don't think I asked the question, but I think it is a really good question. I mean, I feel like people increasingly feel like government is failing them, and part of why government is failing them is that they're just outsourcing things we expect, sort of traditionally expected government to do, to private companies, to corporations. And then we sort of just feel, and I think this actually, I keep asking my friends this. I'm like, how is it that these days, like, everyone just feels financially squeezed? It's like everybody I know just feels squeezed. Like, how did this happen? And I think these things go hand in hand. It's like increasing income inequality and privatization of sort of traditionally government-run services. And so I think there is definitely something here worth exploring. I'd have to think about that more, but I think what I want to do is publish a series of papers that continue to dig into this topic. And the more papers that I publish on this, the more eyes that get on this topic, and then hopefully that inspires other people to take it up, because there's more work than I could possibly do on my own. So so awesome. Thank you for the question. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so thank you again to everybody for coming. Let's give Christopher another round of applause.